With nothing but mounting debts and a failing water pump, Thomas Hargrove makes one final desperate attempt to save 4 generations of farming legacy, digging deeper into the parched earth that had sustained his ancestors since 1876. What he doesn't realize is that 30 feet below his desperate pickaxe swings lies not water, but a hidden cache of Revolutionary War-era treasures worth millions, and evidence of a colonial-era conspiracy that would shake the foundations of Mapleton County's most powerful family. As historian Dr. Rebecca Sullivan helps authenticate his accidental discovery, Thomas finds himself caught between instant wealth and revealing a forgotten land grant that shaped the region's history, but might cost him the very farm he's fighting to save. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The 8th month of drought had turned Evergreen Farm into a landscape that resembled a desert more than the lush valley it had once been. The irrigation ditches that Thomas Hargrove's great-grandfather had dug by hand stood empty, their cracked beds a testament to the severity of the water shortage plaguing Mapleton County. Thomas stood at the edge of what should have been his best cornfield, boots sinking into soil that had once been rich and giving, but now crumbled like dust beneath his weight. At 38, he had weathered challenging seasons before, but nothing like this. His weathered face had settled into permanent lines of worry. His powerful shoulders, built through decades of physical labor, now stooped with the weight of impending failure. "It's not looking good, Scout," he said to the aging border collie at his heels. The dog whined softly, pressing against his leg as they walked toward the ancient stone well that had been the farm's primary water source since 1876. The Hargrove family had survived the Dust Bowl, weathered the farm crisis of the 1980s, and adapted to changing markets for generations. But this drought, combined with 3 consecutive years of falling crop prices, had pushed Evergreen Farm to the brink of collapse. Thomas lifted the wooden cover off the well and dropped a weighted line into its depths. The sound of the weight hitting bottom came much sooner than it should have. He pulled the line back up, noting the barely damp end with a grimace. "Damn near bone dry," he muttered. The county inspector's report had been delivered yesterday, condemning the well as depleted beyond recovery and recommending Thomas connect to the municipal water system, a $75,000 expense he couldn't begin to afford with the bank already threatening foreclosure. 150 acres of corn and soybeans had withered under the relentless sun, reducing his projected income to barely 8% of normal. His last working tractor needed repairs he'd been putting off for months, and the property taxes were already 90 days overdue. Thomas squinted toward the modest 2-story farmhouse where 3 generations of Hargroves had been born and raised. The white paint was peeling, the porch sagging in one corner. His mother had planted hollyhocks along the front walk before cancer took her 5 years ago. They had died within weeks of the drought's onset, as if in sympathy with the failing farm. The sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Thomas turned to see a cloud of dust trailing behind a silver sedan bearing the logo of First Mapleton Bank. Sophia Martinez had been the regional loan officer for nearly a decade. She knew every farmer in the county by name and could recite their crop rotations from memory. Her father had been a migrant farm worker who eventually saved enough to buy his own small orchard, giving her a deeper understanding of agricultural struggles than most bankers. Today, her normally friendly expression was replaced with professional detachment as she approached Thomas. She greeted him with a nod. "I wish this was just a social call." "Final notice?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She handed him an envelope. 60 days, Thomas. That's all the extension I could get you. Corporate's breathing down my neck about non-performing loans in the region." He took the envelope without opening it. "Thanks for trying, Sophia. I know you went to bat for me." She glanced at the dry well, then back to him. Have you considered Cunningham's offer? Thomas's jaw tightened. Walter Cunningham, the wealthy owner of Cunningham Enterprises and the county's largest landowner, had been making increasingly aggressive offers to buy Evergreen Farm for the past year. His latest offer was twice the property's market value, a premium that made Thomas suspicious of the man's motives. "I'm not selling to Cunningham," he said flatly. "Not while I still have options." Sophia's expression softened slightly. "Thomas, I understand the farm's been in your family for generations, but at some point you have to face reality. Without water—" "I'll find water," he interrupted. "There's an underground spring on this property. My great-grandfather documented it in his journals. The well just isn't deep enough anymore." She sighed, clearly having heard similar desperate theories from other farmers facing foreclosure. "Just don't wait too long to consider alternatives. Cunningham's offer won't stay on the table indefinitely." After Sophia left, Thomas stood motionless beside the well, the bank notice crumpled in his fist. Scout pressed against his leg, offering silent comfort. That evening, after reviewing the farm's finances and finding no path to solvency through conventional means, Thomas climbed to the attic of the farmhouse. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight as he made his way to an old cedar chest tucked beneath the eaves. The chest had belonged to his great-grandfather, Elijah Hargrove, who had claimed this land in 1876 after serving in the Union Army. Family legend held that Elijah had used unusual methods to locate water when neighboring homesteaders had failed. To find sustainable sources, Thomas lifted the heavy lid, revealing neatly stacked leather-bound journals, surveying tools, and historical items carefully labeled in faded handwriting. He hadn't examined these materials since inheriting the farm from his father 12 years ago, viewing them more as family heirlooms than practical resources. The earliest journal, dated 1876, detailed Elijah's methodical search for water. April 10th, 1876. "I have observed the morning mist patterns for 2 months and am convinced a significant underground water source runs beneath the western meadow. The native Shawnee spoke of a river beneath the earth in this valley. White settlers dismiss such tales, but I have found indigenous knowledge of land and water to be remarkably accurate." Thomas flipped forward, looking for specific details about the well's construction. June 15th, 1876. "Struck water today at 25 feet. The flow is strong beyond my highest hopes. Curiously, there appears to be stonework already present at this depth. Not natural formation, but man-made. It has the appearance of great age. I have collected samples, but am primarily grateful for the abundant water." The description caught Thomas's attention. Stonework at the well's bottom? He continued reading. June 28th, 1876. "Further excavation reveals the stonework to be part of an older well or chamber, possibly dating to early settlement period. Found several unusual metal objects embedded in the clay. Coins of some sort, though unlike any currency I recognize. They bear markings similar to Spanish pieces, but with unusual symbols that suggest American colonial origin." July 12th, 1876. "Judge Cunningham visited today, expressing unusual interest in purchasing the western section of my claim. Offered twice the going rate. When I declined, suggesting the entire homestead was not for sale, his manner turned cold. Mentioned that water rights in the territory remain legally ambiguous and that I would be wise to accept his generosity." Thomas sat back against a roof beam, his mind racing. His great-grandfather had encountered some kind of artificial structure while digging the well, along with old coins, and a Cunningham had shown interest in the property even then. Could there still be historical artifacts beneath the property? And if so, did that explain Walter Cunningham's unusually generous offers, a continuation of his ancestors' interest? The possibility gave Thomas a renewed sense of purpose. If he could find evidence of historical significance on his property, he might be able to secure a different kind of loan, or at least negotiate with Cunningham from a position of knowledge rather than desperation. The next morning, Thomas began preparations to deepen the well. Without funds to hire professionals, he would have to rely on muscle power and determination, just as his great-grandfather had done. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He gathered old tools from the barn, pickaxes, shovels, and a hand-operated winch system his grandfather had used for well maintenance decades ago. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas secured ropes around the well's edge and lowered himself into its cool depths. The stone walls were a testament to his great-grandfather's craftsmanship, each rock perfectly fitted against its neighbors without mortar, creating a structure that had lasted more than a century. At the bottom, barely 3 inches of muddy water remained where once a constant flow had bubbled up from below. Thomas set his lantern on a small ledge and began to dig, each strike of his pickaxe against the compacted earth echoing up the stone cylinder. He didn't notice the black SUV that had parked on the county road, its occupant observing his activities through high-powered binoculars, or the urgent phone call being made to Cunningham Enterprises' executive offices. For 3 days, Thomas worked from dawn until dusk, stopping only when light failed completely. The well's depth increased foot by painstaking foot. The excavated soil hauled up in buckets and spread across his parched fields. Each evening, he would collapse into his grandfather's old armchair, muscles aching, hands blistered despite his work gloves, and read more from Elijah's journals for guidance. On the 4th day, as Thomas's pickaxe struck the compacted earth at what he estimated to be 30 feet below the surface, something changed. The soil's consistency shifted from dry clay to a grittier, darker material. A few more strikes, and his tool hit something solid, not rock, but something that produced a distinctly metallic sound. "What the hell?" Thomas muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Water would save the farm, give him time to negotiate with the bank, maybe even let him tell Walter Cunningham exactly where he could shove his lowball offer. But this wasn't water. Carefully, he excavated around the solid object, eventually revealing what appeared to be a small metal chest, heavily corroded but intact. It was locked, but the ancient mechanism gave way with a few strategic taps from his pickaxe handle. As the lid creaked open, Thomas's breath caught in his throat, coins, dozens of them, gleaming dully in the lantern light. Not modern currency, but old, exceptionally old. Among them lay what appeared to be a folded document, protected by an oilskin wrapper, several small figurines, and what looked like military insignia from another era. "Scout!" he called up to the dog, who had remained a faithful sentinel at the well's edge. "We've got something better than water, boy." Thomas carefully placed the find in his bucket and continued digging around the area. His efforts revealed not just the chest, but hints of a larger structure, worked stone, forming what might have been a small chamber or hiding place, deliberately constructed beneath what would later become his great-grandfather's well. That evening, Thomas pored over Elijah's journals with new understanding, finding entries he'd previously skimmed. August 1676. Judge Cunningham returned today with a man he introduced as a historical expert. They asked pointed questions about the soil composition and any unusual findings during my well digging. When I mentioned the old stonework, their manner changed noticeably. The expert requested I sell him any worthless old metal I might find, claiming scholarly interest. I provided nothing, though their interest seems excessive. August 15th, 1876. Disturbing visit from Sheriff Wilson today. Claims there have been complaints about unauthorized excavation affecting county water tables. All complaints from Cunningham. Properties. demanded I cease deepening my well-pending investigation. When I requested documentation of these complaints, he became hostile. I have no choice but to comply temporarily, though I suspect underhanded tactics. September 3rd, 1876, received official notice that new territorial regulations prohibit private wells deeper than 25 feet without special permit, a requirement suddenly invented and administered by Judge Cunningham in his capacity as water commissioner. The timing and specificity of this regulation cannot be coincidence. September 30th, 1876. Made a troubling discovery today while in Lancaster for supplies. Overheard conversation between Cunningham and unknown gentlemen discussing revolutionary artifacts and securing historical claims in the county. When they noticed my presence, conversation ceased abruptly. I am now convinced my discovery has greater significance than I realized. Thomas leaned back in his chair, pieces falling into place. His great-grandfather had unknowingly discovered some kind of Revolutionary War-era cache, and the Cunninghams had attempted to force him off his land to claim it. When that failed, they'd used their political influence to restrict his digging, a pattern that seemed to be repeating itself over a century later. But why hadn't the Cunninghams simply claimed the artifacts through normal legal channels? Thomas recalled something from a history course he'd taken at the Agricultural College. In this state, prior to 1880, all artifacts found on private property belonged exclusively to the landowner, with no requirement to report them. If Elijah had maintained ownership through those early challenges, whatever historical treasures existed would still legally belong to the Hargrove family. As Rebecca slipped out with the historical evidence, Thomas moved to answer the front door, Scout at his heels. The familiar silhouette of Sheriff Nate Davis was framed in the doorway, flanked by Sophia Martinez and a tall, immaculately dressed man Thomas recognized as Harold Cunningham, Walter's son, and the current operational head of Cunningham Enterprises. "Thomas," Sheriff Davis nodded, his expression professionally neutral. "Got a moment to talk?" "Seems I don't have much choice," Thomas replied, stepping aside to allow them entry. "What brings the county sheriff out to my property with such interesting company?" The sheriff glanced uncomfortably at Harold Cunningham before responding. "Just following up on some concerns about unauthorized excavation. County's been monitoring groundwater closely during the drought." Thomas's eyebrows rose. "Concerns? From whom?" Harold Cunningham stepped forward, his tailored suit and polished shoes comically out of place in the modest farmhouse kitchen. "Several neighboring properties have reported disruptions to their water access. As the largest agricultural employer in the county, we take water security very seriously." "Interesting," Thomas said coolly. "Considering the closest neighboring property is 2 miles away, and you don't own agricultural land in this valley." Sophia cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable with her role in this visit. "Thomas, we're also concerned about potential damage to the property, given its current status with the bank." "You mean given that you're about to foreclose on it?" Thomas interrupted. "Let's not dance around that fact. The sheriff at least had the decency to look embarrassed." "Look, Thomas, nobody's accusing you of anything. We just need to verify you have the proper permits for well modification during a drought emergency." "Permits that didn't exist until when, exactly?" Thomas asked, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Yesterday, last week." Harold Cunningham's expression tightened. "The County Water Board enacted emergency provisions last month. Section 47B clearly states that all water source modifications require prior approval. The same water board where Cunningham Enterprises holds 3 of 5 seats," Thomas observed. "What a remarkable coincidence." The sheriff held up his hands placatingly. "I'm just doing my job, Thomas. I need to take a look at the well site and document what you're doing." Thomas weighed his options quickly. Rebecca had escaped with the most valuable artifacts in the crucial land grant document. Nothing visible remained that would reveal what he'd actually found. Refusing the inspection would only escalate the situation. "Fine," he said finally. "The well's right outside. I'm trying to reach water before my entire crop fails and my livestock dies of thirst. I wasn't aware I needed government permission to save my own farm." As they moved toward the door, Harold Cunningham hung back, his eyes scanning the kitchen with poorly disguised interest. "Quite a historic property you have here, Hargrove. My father's offer to purchase still stands. Given your financial situation, it might be the most sensible option." Thomas faced him directly. "Why is your family so interested in this particular piece of land, Cunningham? There's plenty of failing farms in the county these days." Something flickered in Cunningham's eyes, calculation perhaps, or caution. "We recognize the historical significance of original homesteads, part of our commitment to preserving county heritage." "How noble," Thomas replied. "Strange that commitment doesn't extend to the families who built that heritage." Outside, Sheriff Davis made a show of inspecting the well, taking photographs and measurements, while Harold Cunningham observed from a distance, occasionally speaking quietly into his phone. Sophia remained by the sheriff's vehicle, her discomfort with the situation evident. "Well's almost dry," the sheriff noted, peering down into the darkness. "You've been digging deeper?" Thomas nodded. "Trying to reach the water table. It's dropped with the drought." "Found anything interesting down there?" The question came from Cunningham, delivered with practiced casualness that didn't match the intensity of his gaze. "Just dirt and disappointment," Thomas replied evenly. "Exactly what you'd expect." The sheriff made some notes on his tablet. "I don't see any immediate safety issues, but I'll have to file a report about the unpermitted modification. There might be fines involved." "Of course there will be," Thomas said, not bothering to hide his bitterness. "Anything to make it harder for a family farm to survive." After they departed, with Cunningham making one final pointed comment about his father's generous offer, Thomas waited 30 minutes to ensure they were truly gone before calling Rebecca. "They're gone," he told her when she answered. "But they're definitely suspicious. The sheriff, the bank, and Harold Cunningham himself showed up with some trumped-up excuse about well permits." "Harold came personally?" Rebecca sounded troubled. "That's unusual. He typically stays in the background while Walter handles the public-facing aspects of their business." "He was very interested in whether I'd found anything interesting in the well," Thomas confirmed, "and he made a point of mentioning their offer to buy the farm again." "They're worried," Rebecca concluded. "I've been examining these artifacts more closely. Thomas, this is extraordinary material. The coins alone represent one of the most significant continental currency finds in decades. And the land grant, if authenticated, could have far-reaching implications for the Cunninghams, for the entire county's property records. This document suggests that much of what became Cunningham Holdings was distributed through fraudulent means, that Judge Abner Cunningham essentially stole land that was intended for independent farmers under the original grant. Thomas processed this information, his mind racing with possibilities. Could this help me save the farm? Potentially, Rebecca said carefully. Historical designation could provide protection from foreclosure, and there might be preservation grants available. But more significantly, if the original land grant is authenticated, it could form the basis for a legal challenge to some of the Cunningham land holdings. Which explains why they've been trying to get this property for generations, Thomas said. It's the smoking gun for their family's original land grab. Exactly. And why they'll do almost anything to prevent this from becoming public knowledge. What's our next step? I've contacted a colleague at the National Archives who specializes in Revolutionary-era documents. She can authenticate the land grant without going through local channels. I'm also reaching out to someone at the State Historical Society, someone I trust implicitly, who has no connections to the Cunninghams. How long will all that take? Thomas asked, acutely aware of the 60-day foreclosure deadline. A week, maybe 2 for preliminary authentication. Full verification would take longer, but we don't need that to get the initial protection in place. 2 weeks, Thomas repeated. I just hope the Cunninghams don't move faster. His concern proved prescient. The following morning, Thomas discovered that overnight someone had placed official-looking, no trespassing, environmental hazard investigation area signs around his well. A notice had been attached to his front door, bearing the county seal and stating that all water source modifications were suspended pending environmental review. Thomas photographed everything before calling Rebecca again. They're moving fast, he told her, using environmental regulations to block my access to the well. Just like they did to your great-grandfather, she noted. I'm not surprised, but this is good evidence of their pattern of behavior. Document everything. That afternoon, Samuel Wilson, an elderly local historian who ran the small Mapleton Historical Society, appeared at Thomas's door, small and spry, despite his 80-plus years. Samuel had known Thomas's father and grandfather. Heard you might be having some trouble with the Cunninghams, he said, without preamble, history repeating itself from what I gather. Thomas invited him in, surprised by the visit. Word travels fast. Samuel's eyes twinkled. Small towns, no secrets. Plus, I've been watching the Cunninghams maneuver for decades. When they start throwing their weight around with emergency regulations and environmental reviews, something interesting is usually happening. Over coffee at the kitchen table, Thomas carefully considered how much to share. Samuel had been a respected figure in the community for generations, with no known ties to the Cunninghams. If anything, he'd been an occasional thorn in their side, documenting aspects of local history they preferred to keep quiet. I found something in the well, Thomas admitted finally, something that might explain why the Cunninghams have been trying to buy this land for over a century. Samuel nodded thoughtfully. I've always wondered about that. Their persistence regarding this particular property has been curious, especially since it's not strategically located for their usual development patterns. What do you know about the original land grants in this valley? Thomas asked, testing the waters. Samuel's expression sharpened with interest. Officially, settlement began around 1850, with Judge Abner Cunningham overseeing land distribution through the Territorial Land Office. But there have always been rumors about earlier settlements, Revolutionary War veterans who came west after the conflict. What if those weren't just rumors? Thomas suggested. Samuel studied him for a long moment. You found something that predates the official settlement history, didn't you? I might have, Thomas acknowledged, and it might challenge the legitimacy of how the Cunninghams acquired their original holdings. The old historian's eyes gleamed. I've spent 60 years piecing together the true history of this county, often against the Cunninghams' active obstruction. Whatever you found, I want to help protect it. And you? Why? Thomas asked, though he was already inclined to trust the man. Because history belongs to everyone, not just to those powerful enough to control its narrative, Samuel replied. Simply, and because your grandfather once helped me when the Cunninghams tried to shut down my research into their family's less savory activities during Prohibition. Thomas made a decision. There's someone you should meet, an expert who's helping me authenticate what I've found. That evening, Rebecca returned to the farm, bringing with her secure containers for properly preserving the remaining artifacts. Thomas had recovered. She and Samuel formed an immediate connection, their shared passion for historical authenticity transcending their age difference. The county records from the 1870s and 1880s are incomplete, Samuel explained, spreading out his own research notes. Conveniently, a fire destroyed many of the original property registrations in 1885, right after Judge Cunningham retired. But I've collected copies of documents that survived in personal collections, church records, and newspaper archives. Rebecca examined his meticulously organized files with professional appreciation. "This is extraordinary work, Mr. Wilson." "Samuel, please," he insisted. "And it's been my life's work, documenting what the powerful would prefer to erase. The question is, how does Thomas's discovery fit into this puzzle?" Together, they reviewed the land grant document and compared it with Samuel's records of the county's settlement patterns. The overlaps were striking. Areas designated in the original grant for independent farming had been precisely the areas where Judge Cunningham had placed the heaviest restrictions on homesteading, forcing many early settlers to abandon their claims through various legal maneuvers. "He knew," Samuel said finally. "Abner Cunningham must have discovered the original grant and systematically worked to suppress it, using his position as land commissioner to ensure the most valuable properties ended up in his family's control. But my great-grandfather managed to hold on to this land despite their pressure," Thomas noted, "which explains their continued interest," Rebecca added. "This property isn't just valuable for its resources, it's dangerous to them because of what it represents. Proof of their original fraud." As night fell, they continued working, creating a secure digital record of all the artifacts and documents, which Rebecca uploaded to multiple protected locations. Samuel contributed his own extensive research files, adding crucial context to the historical narrative they were reconstructing. "The most immediate concern is protecting the farm from foreclosure," Rebecca said as they planned their strategy. "We need to file for historical designation based on the artifacts you've discovered. That would trigger automatic protection while the application is reviewed." "But that would alert the Cunninghams to exactly what we've found," Thomas pointed out. Samuel shook his head. "Not necessarily. We can file based on the architectural and agricultural significance of the original homestead, with only a general reference to period artifacts being discovered. That would give us the initial protection without revealing the full extent of your find." "Meanwhile," Rebecca continued, "my contacts at the National Archives can begin the authentication process on the land grant. Once verified, we can approach the State Historical Society for more comprehensive protection." "And the Cunninghams?" Thomas asked. "They're not going to sit back and watch this happen." "They'll fight," Samuel acknowledged. "They always do, but they prefer to operate in the shadows, using regulations and financial pressure. Once this becomes public, with proper documentation and expert verification, their options narrow considerably." Rebecca nodded in agreement. "The key is moving quickly while maintaining absolute security around the most sensitive discoveries, particularly the land grant. That's what they'd most want to suppress or discredit." They worked late into the night, preparing the historical designation application with Samuel's expert guidance. The elderly historian knew exactly which aspects of the property to emphasize for maximum protection, with minimum disclosure about the recent discoveries. The following morning, Thomas awoke to the sound of heavy vehicles on the road near his property. Looking out, he saw county water department trucks setting up equipment near his property line. "Now what?" he muttered, quickly dressing and heading. Outside, with Scout trotting anxiously beside him, a crew in official-looking uniforms was installing monitoring equipment along the drainage ditch that marked his eastern boundary. Their supervisor, a harried-looking man with a clipboard, intercepted Thomas as he approached. "Mr. Hargrove? I'm Jim Parker from County Water Resources. We're setting up monitoring stations as part of the drought emergency measures." "All along my property line?" Thomas questioned skeptically. "Seems like an unusual coincidence." Parker looked uncomfortable. Just following the work order, sir. Concerns about groundwater contamination in this sector. Contamination that appeared exactly when? I just installed the equipment, Mr. Hargrove, Parker replied, clearly unwilling to be drawn into a confrontation. If you have concerns about the regulatory decision, you'll need to take that up with the water board. The same water board, controlled by Cunningham Enterprises, Thomas noted. How convenient. Parker avoided his gaze. We should be finished by noon. Try not to disturb the monitoring equipment. Tampering with it would be a county violation. Thomas returned to the house and immediately called Rebecca. They're surrounding my property with monitoring equipment. Another obvious attempt to restrict access to the well. Document everything, she advised. Take photos, record any conversations. This pattern of harassment will help establish our case that the Cunninghams are deliberately trying to prevent historical documentation. Meanwhile, Samuel added from the background, we've submitted the historical designation application. The County Preservation Office is required to respond within 5 business days, and I've made sure to submit copies to the state office as well, so the Cunninghams can't simply bury it locally. By mid-morning, Rebecca and Samuel had arrived at the farm to document the water department's activities. Rebecca methodically photographed each piece of equipment and its placement, while Samuel engaged Parker in seemingly innocent conversation about historical drought patterns in the county, skillfully extracting information about who had ordered the sudden monitoring initiative. As they worked, a sleek black car pulled up. Walter Cunningham himself had arrived. Unlike his son's aggressive demeanor, the elder Cunningham cultivated an air of patrician concern, dressed casually but expensively as he approached Thomas with an outstretched hand. Mr. Hargrove, I thought it might be time for us to speak directly. Without intermediaries, he said, his voice smooth and practiced. These regulatory measures aren't personal, just part of the county's drought management. Thomas didn't take the offered hand. Measures that specifically target my property immediately after I start working on my well. That seems quite personal. Mr. Cunningham. Cunningham's smile remained in place, though his eyes hardened slightly. I understand you're under considerable financial pressure. My offer to purchase Evergreen Farm still stands. In fact, given the circumstances, I'm prepared to increase it by 15%. How generous, Thomas replied, not bothering to hide his sarcasm. And what's driving this sudden increase in your valuation of my worthless, drought-stricken land? I have great respect for historical properties, Cunningham said smoothly. This valley's original homesteads represent an important cultural heritage. A heritage your family has been systematically dismantling for generations, Samuel Wilson interjected, approaching from where he'd been observing the conversation. Interesting to hear you express concern for it now. Cunningham's expression tightened at the sight of the elderly historian. Mr. Wilson, still propagating your alternative versions of county history, I see. Not alternative, Walter, just uncensored, Samuel replied mildly. The parts your family has tried to erase from the official records. Cunningham turned back to Thomas, dismissing Samuel with practiced ease. My offer remains open for 48 hours, Mr. Hargrove. After that, I'm afraid market forces and regulatory requirements will take their natural course. He glanced meaningfully at the bank notice visible on Thomas's kitchen table through the window. Some situations can't be reversed once they've progressed too far. After Cunningham departed, Thomas, Rebecca, and Samuel gathered in the kitchen to assess the situation. That was as close to an open threat as a man like Cunningham comes, Samuel observed. He's worried. The increased offer confirms it, Rebecca agreed. They know exactly what you found, or at least suspect strongly. They're trying to gain control of it before we can secure official protection. Thomas paced the worn linoleum floor. 48 hours. He's setting a deadline to force my hand, which means we need to move faster, Rebecca said decisively. "I've heard from my contact at the National Archives. She can review the land grant document tomorrow if we can get it to her. I'll need to drive to Lancaster tonight." "I'll continue working with the County Preservation Office," Samuel added. "I have some influence there still, enough to ensure they don't simply dismiss our application without proper review." "And I'll keep digging," Thomas said, determination hardening his voice. "There might be more artifacts down there, more evidence. If the Cunninghams are this desperate to stop me, I must be close to something significant." As Rebecca prepared to leave with the land grant document securely packed for transport, Thomas walked her to her car. The moment had a weight to it, their connection having deepened through shared purpose over the past few days. "Be careful," he said simply. "The Cunninghams have a long reach. I know their tactics," she assured him. "This won't be my first confrontation with a powerful family trying to bury history that threatens their narrative." Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, both aware of something forming between them that transcended their professional collaboration. "When this is over," Thomas said quietly, "maybe we could focus on the crisis first," Rebecca interrupted gently, though her smile conveyed understanding. "But yes, when this is over, there's a lot I'd like to explore, including whatever else might be hidden beneath Evergreen Farm." After she departed, Thomas returned to the well, determination setting his jaw in a hard line. If the Cunninghams wanted to race against time, he would oblige them by uncovering whatever remaining secrets lay beneath his great-grandfather's well before they could stop him. The ancient stones that had protected his family's water source, for generations now guarded something potentially far more valuable, historical truth that could reshape the county's understanding of its own past and perhaps secure his family's future in the process. With Scout keeping faithful watch from above, Thomas descended once more into the depths, his headlamp illuminating the small chamber he'd partially uncovered. The stonework here was deliberate, carefully constructed, not just a natural formation or simple well bottom. This had been built to hide something, to preserve it for future discovery. As he carefully removed more soil from around the chamber's edges, his hand encountered another solid object, not metal this time, but glass. Gently freeing it from its earthen prison, he found himself holding an ancient bottle, sealed with wax, containing what appeared to be a rolled document. "What else did you hide down here?" Thomas murmured, continuing his careful excavation as darkness fell across Evergreen Farm. Whatever happened with the Cunninghams, the bank, or the county regulators, one thing was becoming clear. His great-grandfather had been right to fight for this land against powerful interests who believed their wealth entitled them to whatever they desired. Now, it was Thomas's turn to continue that fight, armed with the very history his adversaries had tried for generations. To erase, the glass bottle with its wax-sealed document was only the beginning. As Thomas carefully widened the hidden chamber beneath the well, more artifacts emerged from their centuries-long concealment. A leather pouch containing military buttons and insignia. A wooden box with a brass compass bearing the Continental Army's markings. A small collection of personal items, a silver pocket watch, a carved wooden pipe, a bone-handled knife with initials etched into the blade. Most intriguing was a small leather-bound journal, its pages somehow preserved despite the years underground, protected by an ingenious arrangement of stones that had kept groundwater from seeping into this hidden cache. The journal's first page bore a name, Captain Jeremiah Winters, and a date, April 17th, 1777. The discovery sent a thrill through Thomas that had nothing to do with potential financial value. This was history, tangible, personal history, preserved. Like a time capsule beneath his family's farm, whatever Captain Winters had deemed important enough to protect so carefully might well be worth the Cunninghams' determined efforts to acquire it. Thomas secured the new artifacts in waterproof containers before climbing back to the surface. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, and he realized with some surprise that he'd worked through the entire night. Exhaustion suddenly hit him like a physical weight, his muscles aching from the confined labor in the well chamber. He trudged back to the farmhouse, Scout padding loyally beside him. After securing the artifacts in his great-grandfather's cedar chest, Thomas finally collapsed into bed, falling instantly into dreamless sleep. The insistent ringing of his phone woke him just past noon. Rebecca's voice on the other end carried a mix of excitement and caution. "My contact at the National Archives has done a preliminary authentication of the land grant," she reported. "Thomas, it's genuine. The paper, ink composition and handwriting all match verified Franklin documents." From the period, Thomas sat up, instantly alert despite his fatigue. "So we have proof." "Initial proof," Rebecca clarified. "Full authentication will require more testing, but this is enough to proceed with the historical designation application. I'm heading back your way now." "I found more," Thomas told her, describing the additional artifacts he'd uncovered overnight. Rebecca's sharp intake of breath was audible even through the phone. "A journal from Captain Winters himself? Thomas, that's extraordinary. The historical value is exactly why the Cunninghams are so desperate," Thomas finished. "This isn't just about some valuable old coins or military memorabilia. This is evidence that could rewrite the county's entire founding narrative and potentially challenge the legal basis for their land holdings," Rebecca added. "If Judge Cunningham knowingly suppressed the original land grant to seize property that was legally designated for Revolutionary War veterans and their descendants, it could unravel a century and a half of carefully constructed family mythology," Thomas concluded. "No wonder they've been trying to buy this farm since my great-grandfather's time." "Have you looked at the journal yet?" Rebecca asked. "Not yet. I wanted to secure everything first, and honestly I was exhausted after digging all night." "Don't read it until I get there," she advised. "We need to document everything properly. Establish chain of custody. The Cunninghams will challenge anything they can't suppress." After hanging up, Thomas checked his property boundaries. The water department's monitoring equipment remained in place, blinking lights indicating it was actively recording. A county vehicle was parked at the end of his driveway, its occupant making no attempt to hide his surveillance. Thomas called Samuel Wilson, updating him on the latest discoveries and the surveillance situation. "They're scared," Samuel confirmed. "I've been making calls all morning. The County Preservation Office received our historical designation application, but suddenly everyone's out of office or in meetings. Our classic stalling tactics. How long can they delay?" "Legally, 5 business days maximum for initial response. But they can stretch the full review process for months if they're determined." "We don't have months," Thomas reminded him. "The bank's 60-day deadline would be suspended once the initial historical designation is approved," Samuel finished, "which is precisely why they're stalling. But I have some leverage still. The State Historical Society's regional director owes me a favor or 3. I'm heading there this afternoon to make our case directly." By mid-afternoon, Thomas noticed increased activity on the county road. 2 more vehicles had joined the first, and a small drone now hovered at the edge of his property, just far enough away to be legally compliant, but close enough to monitor any activity near the well. Rebecca arrived just before sunset, taking a circuitous route to avoid being followed and parking her car behind the barn. Samuel Wilson arrived 30 minutes later, using the same cautious approach. "The surveillance is escalating," Rebecca observed as they gathered in Thomas's kitchen, away from windows. "Harold Cunningham has mobilized private security in addition to their county allies." They know exactly what's at stake, Samuel said, spreading out papers on the table. I've secured a preliminary review from the State Historical Society. They've agreed to fast-track our application based on the evidence we've provided. That's something, at least, Thomas said. There's more, Samuel continued. I've been doing some digging into First Mapleton Bank's loan portfolio. Guess who holds the majority of their agricultural debt notes? Cunningham Enterprises, Thomas guessed without hesitation. Samuel nodded. Through a series of shell companies and investment trusts, they've been systematically acquiring distressed farm loans throughout the county, particularly for properties with historical significance. Building a land bank, Rebecca concluded. Classic monopolization strategy. Control the debt, then control the land when farmers can't weather a crisis like this drought. But why? Thomas asked. Agricultural land isn't their primary business interest. They're into commercial development, manufacturing technology now. Control, Samuel said simply. The Cunninghams have always understood that true power in this region comes from controlling the land itself. Everything else, politics, business, social standing, flows from that foundation. Rebecca carefully unpacked the new artifacts. Thomas had retrieved her trained historian's hands, treating each item with reverent care as she documented them. These are remarkable, she breathed, examining the Continental Army insignia. Museum-quality preservation. And this compass, it's a Harrison model, exceptionally rare from this period. The wax-sealed glass bottle drew her particular attention. Working with delicate precision, she removed the seal without damaging it, carefully extracting the rolled document inside. Another official document, she noted, gently unrolling it on a clean cotton cloth. Different from the land grant, but related. Her voice trailed off as she read, eyes widening. Thomas, this is a military commission signed by George Washington himself, appointing Jeremiah Winters as special envoy to the Western Territories. Special envoy? Thomas leaned closer. A diplomatic role, Rebecca explained. During the Revolution, Washington sent trusted officers to secure support from frontier settlements and native tribes. This commission grants Winters extraordinary authority to negotiate on behalf of the Continental Congress. Samuel's weathered face creased in concentration. That would explain the land grant's unusual terms. Winters wasn't just any soldier, being rewarded with frontier land. He was carrying out a specific mission for Washington, which makes the Cunninghams' suppression of this history even more significant, Rebecca added. They didn't just steal land, they potentially undermined an official mission sanctioned by the founding government. Thomas carefully opened Captain Winters' journal, its leather binding cracking slightly despite his gentle handling. The first entry, dated April 1777, detailed Winters' departure from Valley Forge with Washington's personal instructions. I am charged with a mission of utmost secrecy and importance. General Washington believes our cause requires secure territory beyond the reach of British forces, where supplies, munitions, and if necessary, a government in exile might be established, should the coastal colonies fall. My journey west begins at first light. As they read further, the journal revealed Winters' arduous journey through hostile territory, his strategic assessment of defensible positions, and eventually his arrival in what would later become Mapleton Valley. May 12, 1777. This valley presents all qualities General Washington specified: natural defenses, abundant water, fertile soil, and sufficient distance from British-controlled territories. The native inhabitants, a small band of Shawnee, have shown unexpected friendship after I treated their chief's son for fever, have begun mapping suitable locations for settlements and defensive positions. The entries continued through summer and fall, documenting Winter's detailed survey of the region and his establishment of caches. Hidden supplies and documents secured in various locations he deemed most defensible. October 3rd, 1777, completed. The primary cache today beneath natural stone formation near Central Spring. Should Providence favor our cause, these supplies and funds may never be needed. Should fortune turn against us, this cache and others like it will serve the patriot cause in darkest hour. The gold and continental currency stored herein would sustain our rebellion or seed new settlement should evacuation become necessary. Thomas looked up, meeting Rebecca's and Samuel's stunned expressions. A Revolutionary War emergency cache, he breathed. Not just memorabilia or personal items, actual strategic resources. The Continental Congress was preparing contingencies. Rebecca said, the historian in her practically vibrating with excitement. If the coastal colonies fell to the British, they had preparations for continuing the government and resistance from the frontier. This valley was part of that plan. And somehow, Judge Abner Cunningham discovered this history when he became Territorial Land Commissioner, Samuel concluded. Instead of honoring the original purpose, he exploited his position to claim the land for himself, including whatever remained of the emergency resources Winters had hidden, Thomas added. They continued reading, finding entries that detailed Winters' construction of the stone chamber Thomas had discovered. Not originally a well at all, but a carefully designed hiding place for the most sensitive documents and valuable resources. November 17, 1777, completed the secure chamber today, designed to withstand flooding, with hidden airflow channels to prevent dampness. The most crucial documents and significant portion of Congress's gold reserve now rest 20 feet below stone cap, accessible only to those with knowledge of its location. Should I fall in service to our cause, I have dispatched sealed instructions to General Washington detailing this and other caches throughout Western territories. The final entries were dated spring 1778, describing Winter's decision to remain in the valley rather than return east as originally planned. April 30th, 1778. Received dispatch today confirming French alliance. Our cause strengthens, though much fighting remains. General Washington approves my request to establish permanent settlement here, believing Western expansion crucial to new nation's future security. Have begun constructing proper dwelling near the spring. This valley shall become home to patriots who fought for liberty, a testament to what we have sacrificed and what we yet hope to build. The journal ended abruptly in June 1778, with no explanation for the cessation of entries. Whether Winters had continued in another volume or met some untimely end remained unclear. "This is remarkable," Rebecca said softly, carefully closing. The journal, not just historically significant, but potentially valuable beyond measure if there was continental gold hidden in that chamber. "Most of it is probably long gone," Samuel cautioned. Elijah Hargrove's journals mentioned finding the stone chamber, but he described it as partially collapsed and appearing to have been previously disturbed. Abner Cunningham, Thomas guessed. He found part of the cache, but not all of it. Maybe he didn't discover the chamber's full extent or couldn't access certain areas, which would explain the Cunninghams' persistent interest in this property specifically, Rebecca noted. They knew there was more to be found. But they couldn't just dig it up without exposing what they'd already taken, Samuel added. So, they've been trying for generations to acquire the land legally, which would give them the right to excavate without questions. Thomas sat back, processing the implications. So my farm isn't just sitting on historical artifacts. It potentially contains part of the Continental Congress's emergency gold reserve. and more importantly, documents that would expose the Cunningham's original fraud, Rebecca emphasized. The historical value far exceeds any gold that might remain. A sudden noise outside drew their attention. Headlights sweeping across the front of the house as multiple vehicles pulled into the driveway. Thomas moved to the window, peering carefully through the curtains. Sheriff's Department, 3 vehicles, and Harold Cunningham's car behind them. Rebecca quickly began packing the artifacts back into secure containers. They're moving faster than I expected. We need to protect these documents before they find a pretext to confiscate them. On what grounds could they possibly? Thomas began. They'll invent something, Samuel interrupted. Historical preservation violations, improper handling of cultural resources, disturbing protected groundwater, it doesn't matter what. They just need to get their hands on these items long enough to make them disappear. The sharp rap of knuckles on the front door was followed by Sheriff Davis's voice. Thomas, Sheriff's Department, we need to speak with you. Rebecca finished securing the artifacts in her reinforced case. I'll take these out the back. My car's hidden behind the barn. Samuel can create a distraction while you deal with the sheriff. Thomas nodded grimly. Be careful. They may have the property surrounded. I know these old farms better than they do, Samuel assured him. There's a drainage culvert that runs under the Northfield access road. Rebecca can use that to bypass their perimeter. Thomas moved to answer the door, composing his features into a mask of tired irritation rather than alarm. Sheriff Davis stood on the porch, flanked by 2 deputies. Behind them, Harold Cunningham waited beside his luxury SUV, speaking intently into his phone. Little late for a social call, Sheriff, Thomas remarked, deliberately blocking the doorway. Davis had the decency to look uncomfortable. Not social, Thomas. We have a court order to inspect the well site. Environmental judge signed off on it an hour ago. Concerns about aquifer contamination from unauthorized excavation. At night, with an armed escort? Thomas questioned, nodding toward the deputy's holstered weapons. Procedure, Davis said, not meeting his eyes. I need you to cooperate, Thomas. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Through the window, Thomas could see Samuel emerging from the side door, making a show of angrily confronting Harold Cunningham, the perfect distraction, as Rebecca slipped away in the opposite direction, case in hand. Let me see the court order, Thomas demanded, playing for time. Davis handed over an official-looking document. Thomas made a show of reading it carefully, though the legal language was largely meaningless to him. This says you can inspect the, well, not enter my home, he noted, finding at least that much clear in the document. The well is our only interest, Davis confirmed, seeming relieved that Thomas wasn't challenging the order itself. Then let's get it over with, Thomas said, stepping outside and pulling the door shut behind him. But just so we're clear, Sheriff, I know exactly what this is about, and it has nothing to do with water contamination. Davis avoided his gaze, gesturing toward the well. Harold Cunningham abandoned his heated discussion with Samuel to join them, his expression a carefully composed mask of civic concern. Mr. Hargrove, he nodded stiffly, I appreciate your cooperation in this environmental matter. Save it, Cunningham, Thomas replied. We both know this has nothing to do with the environment and everything to do with what your great-grandfather stole from this valley. A flicker of alarm crossed Cunningham's composed features before he recovered. I'm not sure what conspiracy theory you've embraced, but our concern is strictly the protection of the county's groundwater resources. With a private security team? Thomas challenged, nodding toward 2 unmarked vehicles whose occupants were now establishing a perimeter around the property. Standard procedure for monitoring potentially hazardous sites during drought conditions, Cunningham replied smoothly. Sheriff, perhaps we should proceed with the inspection before darkness complicates your officer's work. At the well, Davis and his deputies made a show of taking water samples and photographs, while Cunningham observed with poorly disguised impatience. One deputy lowered a specialized camera into the well shaft, the feed displaying on a tablet. Cunningham watched intently. "You've been quite busy down there," Cunningham observed, studying the images of the expanded chamber Thomas had excavated. "Unusual stonework for a simple farm well." "My great-grandfather was known for his craftsmanship," Thomas replied neutrally. The deputy operating the camera frowned at the screen. "There's a side chamber here. Looks deliberately constructed. That's not standard well design." Cunningham's interest sharpened visibly. "We'll need to inspect that more thoroughly. Environmental concerns could extend to any connected chambers. Your court order covers the well, not archaeological excavation," Thomas pointed out. "If you want to dig, you'll need a different kind of warrant." The sheriff looked uncomfortable with the confrontation. "He's right, Mr. Cunningham. This order is specifically for water quality testing and structural assessment." Frustration flashed across Cunningham's features before his practiced composure returned. "Of course. We wouldn't want to exceed our authority. Perhaps a follow-up inspection with proper archaeological oversight would be appropriate." "Which you'll arrange through your family's influence on the County Historical Commission," Thomas said, not bothering to hide his contempt. "Just like your great-grandfather used his position to steal land that was meant for Revolutionary War veterans." Cunningham's facade cracked slightly at this direct reference. "You should be careful making unfounded historical claims, Mr. Hargrove, especially when your property is facing foreclosure. Desperate circumstances often lead to creative interpretations of history." "Nothing creative about a land grant signed by Benjamin Franklin," Thomas replied, watching Cunningham's reaction carefully, "or a military commission signed by George Washington himself." The blood visibly drained from Cunningham's face before he regained control. Interesting fantasy. If such documents existed, they would of course belong in a proper museum or archival facility, where they'd promptly disappear, just like the other evidence your family has been suppressing for generations, Thomas countered. The sheriff cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating tension. "We've completed the required samples and assessments, Mr. Cunningham, unless there's something specific in the court order I've overlooked." Cunningham's jaw tightened, but he shook his head. "No, Sheriff. Your department has been quite thorough. Mr. Hargrove, you'll be receiving official notice regarding the findings once the samples have been analyzed." "I'm sure I will," Thomas replied dryly, "probably along with some newly discovered regulation that prohibits historic wells entirely." As the sheriff's vehicles departed, Samuel made his way back to Thomas, watching Cunningham's SUV disappear down the driveway. "Rebecca got away clean," he said quietly. "The artifacts are secure." Thomas released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "He knows, Samuel. I deliberately mentioned the Franklin and Washington documents. You should have seen his face." "A calculated risk," Samuel acknowledged. "But now we know for certain that he's aware of what his family suppressed. That might actually help us. Desperate people make mistakes." "And the Cunninghams are definitely getting desperate," Thomas agreed. "That court order appeared awfully quickly for normal county procedures." "Nothing normal about any of this," Samuel replied. "They're accelerating their efforts, which means we need to do the same. I'm going to contact every historical preservation organization in the state tonight. By morning, this won't just be a local issue anymore." An hour later, Rebecca returned, having secured the artifacts with her university colleague, who operated an independent authentication laboratory. "They're documenting everything properly," she reported. "Chain of custody, preservation protocols, the works. No one can claim these were found under suspicious circumstances or mishandled. Cunningham knows about the Washington and Franklin documents. Thomas told her, explaining the confrontation at the well. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. That explains why my colleague spotted a tail on my way to the lab. They lost me when I switched. Vehicles at the gas station, but they're definitely mobilizing resources to track these artifacts. How long until we have official authentication? Thomas asked. Preliminary results by morning. Full authentication will take longer, but the initial assessment should be enough to secure emergency historical designation. Samuel, who had been making calls from the porch, rejoined them with a satisfied expression. The State Historical Society's director is personally reviewing our application first thing tomorrow. I've also alerted 3 independent preservation organizations and 2 academic institutions with significant influence in historic property protection. And I've prepared documentation for emergency injunctive relief, Rebecca added. If the Cunninghams attempt to use their local influence to block the designation process, we can file directly with the state court. Thomas felt a surge of hope. For the first time in months, so we have a chance. More than a chance, Rebecca assured him. What you've discovered isn't just locally significant, Thomas. This is nationally important history, a direct connection to Washington's contingency planning during the Revolution. Once that's established, not even the Cunninghams' influence can easily suppress it. As they continued planning their strategy, Thomas's phone rang. Sophia Martinez from the bank. Thomas. Her voice sounded strained. I need to warn you. The bank is accelerating the foreclosure process on orders from the executive committee. They're filing paperwork to take possession in 72 hours, not the 60 days I told you before. They can't do that, Thomas protested. There are procedures, legal time frames. They're citing emergency provisions in your loan agreement related to property modifications affecting collateral value, Sophia interrupted. It's a stretch legally, but by the time you could fight it in court, they'd already have possession. Cunningham, Thomas concluded grimly. He's pulling strings at the bank. I can't confirm that officially, Sophia said carefully. But the order came immediately after Harold Cunningham had a private meeting with our president this evening. Why are you telling me this, Sophia? You're risking your job. There was a pause before she answered. Because my father lost his orchard to similar tactics 30 years ago. The Cunninghams have been using the same playbook for generations, and it's wrong. I can't stop the process officially, but I thought you deserved fair warning. After thanking her and ending the call, Thomas relayed the news to Rebecca and Samuel. 72 hours, Rebecca repeated, her expression grim. They're trying to take possession before the historical designation can be processed. Which means we need to accelerate everything, Samuel said. I'll call the Historical Society director at home tonight. Rebecca, can your colleagues work through the night on the authentication? She nodded. For a discovery of this magnitude, absolutely. I'll call them now. And I'll keep digging, Thomas said with determination. If Winters hid more evidence down there, we need to find it before the Cunninghams find a way to stop us completely. As they mobilized their respective efforts, Thomas couldn't help but feel a connection to his great-grandfather and to Captain Winters before him, men who had stood against powerful interests to protect something larger than themselves. Whatever happened in the coming days, he was part of a chain of resistance stretching back to the very founding of the nation, a responsibility he now embraced fully. The well that had run dry had revealed something far more precious than water, a buried truth that might finally break the Cunninghams' century-long stranglehold on the county's land and history. Dawn broke over Evergreen Farm with a tense stillness. Thomas, having barely slept, watched the sunrise from his kitchen window. The farm that had been his family's home for generations now felt like contested ground, a battlefield in a war that had been silently raging for over a century. In the distance, he could see the county vehicles still parked at his property line, their occupants maintaining the pretense of environmental monitoring while actually surveilling his every move. Overnight, their numbers had increased, evidence that the Cunninghams were escalating their efforts as the historical significance of his discovery became clear. His phone rang. Rebecca, calling from the authentication lab where she'd spent the night working with her colleagues. "It's official," she said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "The Washington Commission and Franklin Land Grant have been preliminarily authenticated by 3 independent experts. The journal's handwriting matches other known samples of Winter's writing from military records. Thomas, this is indisputable historical evidence. Will it be enough to stop the foreclosure?" That remained his most pressing concern. Without the farm, all the historical discoveries in the world wouldn't matter. Samuel is meeting with the State Historical Society Board right now. With this level of authentication, they can issue an emergency preservation order that would suspend any property transfer or modification pending full historical assessment. "The Cunninghams will fight it," Thomas said, watching another black SUV slow as it passed his driveway. "Of course they will, but this moves beyond local influence. This is Revolutionary War history with national significance. Washington's direct involvement elevates it to a level where even the Cunninghams can't easily suppress it." Thomas finished his coffee, determination setting his jaw. "What's our next move?" "Document everything. I'm bringing a professional archaeological team from the university this afternoon, people I trust completely. We need to properly excavate and record the well chamber before the Cunninghams find some way to interfere." "They're watching every move I make," Thomas warned. "They'll know the moment your team arrives." "Let them watch," Rebecca replied, with fierce determination. "In fact, I've invited a journalist from the state newspaper to document the excavation. The more public this becomes, the harder it will be for them to interfere." The unexpected sound of vehicles on his driveway cut their conversation short. Thomas moved to the window, tension coiling through him at the sight of Harold Cunningham's luxury SUV, followed by 2 sheriff's department vehicles. "They're here," he told Rebecca. "Harold Cunningham and the sheriff again. Remember, you have rights. Don't let them access the well without proper documentation. I'm 30 minutes away. Stall them if you can." Thomas ended the call and stepped onto his porch as the visitors emerged from their vehicles. Harold Cunningham's normally impeccable appearance showed subtle signs of strain. His tie slightly askew, faint shadows beneath his eyes, suggesting a sleepless night. "Mr. Hargrove," Cunningham's tone was clipped, professional. "We have a court order requiring immediate inspection of the historical artifacts reportedly discovered on this property." Thomas crossed his arms, leaning against the porch post. "By we, I assume you mean the sheriff's department? Last I checked, Cunningham Enterprises doesn't have law enforcement authority." Sheriff Davis stepped forward, extending an official document. "The County Historical Preservation Commission has issued this order, Thomas. Any artifacts of historical significance must be properly documented and secured by authorized personnel." Thomas didn't reach for the paper. "The same commission where 3 of 5 members are Cunningham appointees? That's hardly an independent authority. And since when does the Historical Commission deploy armed deputies for artifact preservation?" Cunningham's composed facade cracked slightly, revealing impatience. "The artifacts you've allegedly discovered could have profound historical significance. They require professional handling and preservation. Exactly why I've already engaged Dr. Rebecca Sullivan and her team from the State University," Thomas countered. professional historians with no financial interest in the outcome, unlike yourself. Unauthorized excavation of potential historical sites violates County Ordinance 47-3, Cunningham pressed. The Commission has the authority to what? Samuel Wilson's voice interrupted as the elderly historian's truck pulled into the driveway. To suddenly enforce regulations that have been ignored for decades when it suits the Cunningham family interests. Samuel approached the group with remarkable energy for his age, waving a document of his own. I have here an emergency preservation directive from the State Historical Society issued 20 minutes ago, designating Evergreen Farm as a site of exceptional historical significance related to the American Revolution. He handed the document to Sheriff Davis, who skimmed it with a frown. This places all historical artifacts and related structures under state protection, pending comprehensive assessment. Any removal or alteration of artifacts would constitute a state-level offense. Cunningham grabbed the paper from the sheriff, scanning it with barely concealed fury. This is procedurally irregular. The county commission has primary jurisdiction. Not when state and potentially national historical significance is established, Samuel interrupted. The discovery of documents directly connected to George Washington and Benjamin Franklin automatically elevates this beyond county authority. Thomas watched the exchange with growing confidence. Samuel's tactical understanding of preservation law was proving invaluable. Cunningham turned to Thomas, his composure now visibly strained. Let's be reasonable, Hargrove. Whatever you found, we can reach an accommodation. My family has always been committed to preserving local history, with the resources to do it properly. The way your great-grandfather preserved the original land grant, Thomas challenged, by burying it in bureaucracy and stealing land meant for Revolutionary War veterans. Sheriff Davis cleared his throat uncomfortably. Perhaps we should all step back and coordinate properly between county and state authorities. I don't want my department caught in a jurisdictional dispute. The sheriff's reluctance to proceed confirmed what Thomas had suspected. The local authorities might be influenced by the Cunninghams, but outright defiance of state directives was beyond what most were willing to risk. A wise approach, Sheriff, Samuel agreed smoothly, particularly since the State Attorney General's office has expressed interest in reviewing how county historical resources have been managed. Something about potential patterns of suppression regarding founding-era documents. This was a bluff. Samuel had mentioned no such interest from the Attorney General, but the effect on Cunningham was immediate. His face paled slightly before he regained control. This isn't over, Hargrove, he said quietly. My family has protected this county's development for generations. We won't allow historical revisionism to undermine that legacy. It's not revisionism when it's based on primary documents your family deliberately suppressed, Thomas replied evenly. Captain Winter's journal tells quite a different story about how this valley was meant to develop. The mention of Winter's journal sent another visible shock through Cunningham. Clearly, he hadn't known about this additional piece of evidence. Sheriff, we'll reassess our approach in light of this state directive, Cunningham said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Please document that we registered formal concern about the preservation standards being employed here. As they departed, Samuel turned to Thomas with a triumphant smile. That buys us time, but not much. Harold will be on the phone to their attorneys immediately, looking for ways to challenge the state directive. How long will the emergency designation protect us? Thomas asked. 30 days guaranteed, during which no property transfer or physical alteration can occur. After that, it depends on the findings of the full historical assessment. But if Rebecca's authentication holds up, and I'm confident it will, this property could receive permanent historical designation, which would prevent foreclosure. Samuel nodded. The bank couldn't transfer ownership of a designated historical site without extensive review and approval. More importantly, there are federal grants available for maintaining historically significant properties, enough to address your immediate financial concerns. The sound of approaching vehicles heralded Rebecca's arrival. 3 university vans pulled in, carrying equipment and a team of 6 people in fieldwork clothing. Rebecca emerged from the lead vehicle, accompanied by a woman with a professional camera who Thomas guessed was the journalist she'd mentioned. "Samuel, you did it!" Rebecca called as she approached. The state directive came through just in time. "Temporarily blocked the Cunninghams, at least," Samuel confirmed, though Harold seemed particularly disturbed by the mention of Winter's journal. "Nay, that's because it directly contradicts the official county history the Cunninghams have cultivated," Rebecca explained. According to their version, settlement began with their ancestor Jeremiah Cunningham in 1820, who civilized an untamed wilderness. The existence of a planned Revolutionary-era settlement established by Washington's direct representative demolishes that narrative completely. The journalist, whom Rebecca introduced as Elaine Myers from the State Tribune, was already taking notes. "This could be one of the most significant historical revisions in state history," she commented. "May I see some of the artifacts that have prompted this reassessment?" Rebecca and Samuel exchanged glances before Rebecca nodded. "We can show you photographs of the authenticated documents, but the originals are secure at the university laboratory. What we're doing today is properly excavating and documenting the chamber where they were found." As the archaeological team began setting up their equipment, Thomas led them to the well. The chamber he'd partially uncovered was carefully expanded under Rebecca's direction, with proper archaeological techniques now employed to document every aspect of the discovery. By mid-afternoon, their methodical excavation had revealed the full extent of Winter's hidden chamber, a remarkably sophisticated structure for its time, with carefully designed drainage channels and air vents that had helped preserve its contents despite nearly 250 years underground. Elaine Myers documented everything. Her initial professional interest clearly transformed into genuine excitement as the historical significance became evident. This changes the entire narrative of Western settlement in the post-revolutionary period, she noted, photographing the chamber. The idea that Washington was establishing contingency outposts this far west, decades before official territorial expansion. It's revolutionary in its implications for American history. Thomas watched the experts' work, struck by the contrast between their careful, respectful approach and the Cunninghams' attempts to seize and potentially suppress these discoveries. This wasn't just about saving his farm anymore, it was about restoring historical truth that had been deliberately buried for generations. As the excavation continued, they uncovered additional artifacts, more continental currency, military supplies, including a small cache of musket balls and flints, and most significantly, a small iron box containing several gold coins bearing the early American eagle design. "Continental gold," Rebecca breathed, carefully documenting the find before securing it for transport. Winters mentioned Congress's gold reserve in his journal. This confirms he was establishing more than just a personal hideaway. This was an official operation with national resources. By evening, the excavation had been properly documented, the artifacts carefully catalogued and secured for transport to the university's preservation facilities. Elaine Myers departed with enough material for what she promised would be a front-page story in the Sunday edition. As the archaeological team packed up their equipment, Thomas, Rebecca, and Samuel gathered on the porch, watching the sunset paint the drought-stricken fields in golden light. "What happens now?" Thomas asked. "The historical assessment proceeds. Formally, Rebecca explained. With today's additional discoveries, there's no question about the site's significance. The state designation will become permanent, which protects the property from foreclosure or development. And the Cunninghams? Thomas pressed. Samuel's expression grew serious. They won't give up easily. Expect legal challenges to the designation, attempts to discredit the artifacts, perhaps even personal attacks on our credibility. They've spent generations building their version of history. They won't abandon it without a fight. But they've lost the advantage of secrecy, Rebecca pointed out. Once Elaine's story breaks, this becomes public knowledge. The Cunninghams thrive on operating in the shadows. Public scrutiny changes the equation considerably. The ringing of Thomas's phone interrupted their conversation. The screen showed Sophia Martinez calling from the bank. "Thomas?" Her voice was low, urgent. "I'm calling to warn you. The bank's executive committee just held an emergency meeting. They're filing for immediate possession of Evergreen Farm tomorrow morning, claiming material breach of loan conditions." "They can't do that," Thomas protested. "The state historical designation. They're claiming the designation was fraudulently obtained based on manufactured evidence. Harold Cunningham presented some kind of expert testimony questioning the authenticity of the artifacts." Thomas felt a cold anger building. "That's impossible. The artifacts have been authenticated by multiple independent experts." "I know," Sophia agreed, "but the bank president isn't waiting for counter-evidence. They're moving forward at 9 a.m. tomorrow unless you can secure an emergency injunction." After ending the call, Thomas relayed the information to Rebecca and Samuel. "We expected this," Rebecca said grimly. "They're trying to seize the property before the historical designation can be fully processed." "Can they really claim the evidence is fraudulent?" Thomas asked. "Your team's authentication was thorough." "They can claim anything," Samuel responded. "The question is whether a judge will grant their motion before we can present our counter-evidence." Rebecca was already on her phone. "I'm contacting my university's legal department. They can file for an emergency injunction tonight, based on the archaeological work we've documented today." Samuel nodded approvingly. "And I'll call Judge Hernandez directly. She sits on the State Historical Society board and can verify the legitimacy of our application process." As they mobilized their defenses, headlights appeared on the driveway again. This time it was a single vehicle, an older model luxury car that Thomas didn't recognize. "Now what?" he muttered, stepping off the porch as the car stopped and its elderly driver emerged. To Thomas's surprise, it was Walter Cunningham himself, Harold's father and the senior patriarch of the Cunningham dynasty. Unlike his son's aggressive approach, the elder Cunningham moved with the careful dignity of his 80-plus years, leaning slightly on an elegant walking stick. "Mr. Hargrove," he nodded in greeting. "I believe we should talk directly, without lawyers, without officials, just two men whose families have been connected to this valley for generations." Thomas studied the old man carefully. Despite his age, Walter Cunningham's eyes remained sharp, assessing. "Your son already tried the direct approach this morning. It didn't go well." A ghost of a smile crossed Cunningham's lined face. "Harold has many qualities, but subtlety isn't among them. He views this situation as a threat to be neutralized. I see it somewhat differently." Rebecca and Samuel had joined Thomas, forming a protective flank. Walter acknowledged them with a nod. "Dr. Sullivan, your reputation for historical integrity precedes you, and Mr. Wilson, we've crossed paths before, I believe." "Several times over the decades," Samuel confirmed dryly, "usually when your family was attempting to rewrite local history for your convenience." "A perspective I'd expect from you," Cunningham replied without heat. "May I come in? My standing endurance isn't what it once was." Thomas hesitated, then nodded. Whatever the old man's purpose, it might provide insight into the Cunninghams' strategy. In the farmhouse kitchen, Walter Cunningham settled into a chair, his movements suggesting the pain of arthritis despite his dignified bearing. "I'll be direct, Mr. Hargrove. The artifacts you've discovered present a complicated situation for my family, because they expose how your great-grandfather stole land that was designated for Revolutionary War veterans," Thomas challenged. "History is rarely that simple," Cunningham replied. Abner Cunningham operated within the legal framework of his time. Territorial development required strong central authority and consolidated resources. It required honoring the original intent of the land grants, not subverting them for personal gain, Rebecca countered. Cunningham sighed. "We could debate historical interpretations endlessly. My purpose here is more practical. I'm authorized to offer you a final settlement, triple the market value of your property with the provision that all historical artifacts be donated to the County Historical Society for proper preservation, where they would promptly disappear into storage, never to be publicly displayed," Samuel observed. "Your cynicism is understandable but misplaced," Cunningham said smoothly. "We've always supported historical preservation appropriate to our region's development." The key word being appropriate, Thomas noted, meaning history that doesn't challenge the Cunningham family narrative. "Every community shapes its history to reflect its values," Cunningham replied philosophically. "The question is whether you wish to become a wealthy man, Mr. Hargrove, or engage in a protracted legal battle that will ultimately benefit no one." Thomas studied the elderly man across from him, suddenly struck by the weight of history present in this moment. "You knew about Captain Winters all along, didn't you? Your family has known for generations what really happened here." Something flickered in the old man's eyes, not quite guilt, but perhaps a recognition of shared understanding. Family histories contain many nuances that aren't part of public record. My grandfather spoke of certain documents Abner had secured during the territorial period. Their specific nature wasn't elaborated upon. "Convenient ambiguity," Rebecca observed, "maintaining plausible deniability across generations." "What's your real concern here?" Thomas pressed. "It's not just about one farm or even some old documents. What are you actually afraid of?" Walter Cunningham remained silent for a moment, his aged hands resting on the silver head of his walking stick. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its practiced polish. "Stability, Mr. Hargrove. The Cunningham family has guided this county's development for generations, creating prosperity and growth where there might otherwise have been stagnation. At the cost of the original vision for this valley," Samuel interjected, "a community of independent farmers and tradespeople rather than a fiefdom controlled by one family. A romantic notion, but impractical for actual development," Cunningham dismissed. "The point remains, these discoveries threaten to destabilize a carefully balanced system, not just our family's position, but the county's entire economic structure. Because it reveals that your family's foundational claim to authority was built on a lie," Thomas concluded. "That's what truly threatens you, not the financial implications, but the legitimacy question." The old man's expression hardened slightly. "I'm offering you a practical solution that benefits everyone. Financial security for yourself, historical recognition for the artifacts, and continued stability for the community. Except it doesn't actually preserve the historical truth," Rebecca pointed out. "It buries it again, just as your family has done for generations." Thomas shook his head. "I won't sell, Mr. Cunningham. Not at triple the value, not at 10 times the value. This farm represents something more important than money. It's a direct connection to this valley's original purpose." Walter Cunningham studied him for a long moment. "You remind me of your great-grandfather," Elijah Hargrove was equally stubborn about this property, refused every offer, fought every attempt to integrate this land into the broader development. Vision. Because he understood what was at stake wasn't just property, but principle, Thomas replied. The old man rose slowly, his movements careful but dignified. Then we find ourselves at an impasse. I had hoped for a reasonable resolution, but it seems we must proceed through official channels. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed an envelope. This arrived at my office today. Perhaps you should see it before it becomes public. Thomas accepted the envelope cautiously. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a laboratory analysis of soil samples taken from around his well during the sheriff's inspection the previous day. "What is this supposed to prove?" he asked, scanning the technical document. "Read the highlighted section," Cunningham suggested, "about the chemical composition of the soil surrounding your artifacts." Rebecca took the paper, her professional training allowing her to interpret the data more effectively. Her expression grew troubled as she read. "They're claiming chemical analysis shows modern compounds in the soil immediately surrounding the artifact chamber, suggesting recent contamination inconsistent with long-buried objects. A defalsified results," Samuel concluded immediately. "Another Cunningham tactic." "From a nationally recognized independent laboratory," Cunningham countered. "One your university colleagues would find difficult to discredit quickly." Thomas understood the strategy immediately. "You're trying to create doubt about the artifact's authenticity, just enough to delay the historical designation while the bank seizes the property. I'm merely showing you what will become part of the legal record tomorrow," Cunningham replied with practiced innocence. "How judges interpret scientific evidence is beyond my control." "This is manipulation of the worst kind," Rebecca said, angrily, deliberately misinterpreting normal soil composition variations to create a false narrative of tampering. "Aye, perhaps," Cunningham acknowledged. "Or perhaps there are aspects of your discovery that warrant more careful examination. Either way, the legal process will now take its course, a process that typically favors those with the resources for extended litigation." As Walter Cunningham departed, his parting words hung in the air. "Consider my offer, Mr. Hargrove. It remains open until morning." Thomas, Rebecca, and Samuel gathered around the kitchen table, examining the soil analysis. "Report. This is cleverly done," Rebecca admitted reluctantly. "They've identified trace chemical compounds that could be interpreted as modern contamination by someone not familiar with archaeological preservation standards." "Can it be refuted?" Thomas asked. "Eventually, yes. We can demonstrate that. These compounds are consistent with natural ground leaching, not contamination. But it creates exactly what the Cunninghams want: reasonable doubt that will slow the designation process. And meanwhile, the bank moves to seize the property," Thomas concluded grimly. Samuel's weathered face set with determination. "Then we change the battlefield. This isn't just about local history anymore. It's about national heritage. We need to elevate this beyond the Cunningham sphere of influence." "The press coverage will help," Rebecca noted. "Elaine's story will break tomorrow morning." "But we need something more immediate," Samuel pressed. "Something that forces official recognition before the bank can act." Rebecca's phone chimed with an incoming message. As she read it, her expression transformed from concern to triumph. "This might be exactly what we need. My colleagues at the Authentication Lab have completed their assessment of Captain Winter's commission document. And," Thomas prompted, "it's not just a standard military commission. It contains specific language authorizing Winters to establish a permanent repository of essential governance documents in territories beyond British reach." Thomas, this wasn't just a contingency outpost. It was potentially an emergency capital for the fledgling nation if Philadelphia fell. Samuel's eyes widened. That elevates this from state historical significance to national, if Washington was establishing backup governmental sites. Exactly, Rebecca confirmed. I've just forwarded this to my contact at the National Archives. This falls under their direct preservation mandate. They can issue an immediate federal protection order that supersedes any local action. Including the bank's seizure attempt? Thomas asked, hope rising. Including that, Rebecca confirmed. Federal historical designation trumps private property proceedings when nationally significant artifacts are involved. Thomas felt a weight lifting from his shoulders for the first time in months. So we have a chance. More than a chance, Samuel assured him. The Cunninghams excel at manipulating local systems, but federal intervention changes everything. Harold may control the county commissioners and influence local judges, but even the Cunninghams can't simply override the National Archives. Through the night, they worked to prepare their defense against the morning's bank proceedings. Rebecca coordinated with her university colleagues and the National Archives representative, who was now flying in from Washington. Samuel activated his network of historical preservation advocates, ensuring witnesses would be present at the courthouse. Thomas reviewed his great-grandfather's journals, finding additional evidence of Abner Cunningham's systematic efforts to suppress the valley's true historical significance. Dawn was breaking when Thomas stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand, to watch the sunrise over Evergreen Farm. The drought-stricken fields remained parched, the immediate agricultural crisis unresolved, but for the first time in months, he felt something beyond the constant pressure of impending loss, a sense of purpose that transcended mere survival. This land had never been just a farm. It had been a deliberate choice by Captain Winters, a place selected for its strategic importance to a nation fighting for its very existence. It had been Elijah Hargrove's stand against corruption and power, his determination to honor the land's intended purpose despite pressure to surrender it. Now, it had become Thomas's contribution to restoring historical truth, uncovering a buried chapter of American history that powerful interests had worked for generations to suppress. The sound of vehicles approaching drew his attention. Not the bank's representatives or Cunningham's security, but Rebecca returning with several official-looking cars bearing federal government plates. She emerged from her vehicle with a triumphant smile, waving a document. Federal Protection Order, she called as she approached the porch. Signed by the director of the National Archives himself at 4 a.m., Evergreen Farm is now officially designated as a site of exceptional national historical significance, with all property and artifacts placed under federal protection pending comprehensive assessment. Thomas descended the steps to meet her, relief and gratitude overwhelming him. They actually did it, that quickly. The Washington connection changed everything, she explained. When national founding documents are involved, they don't hesitate. The director actually said this could be one of the most significant Revolutionary-era discoveries of the century. The federal representatives introduced themselves: a historical preservation specialist, a security coordinator, and a legal advisor from the Department of the Interior. They explained that, effective immediately, no local authority could authorize property transfer or modification without federal approval. As they discussed next steps, Samuel arrived, followed shortly by Elaine Myers with the first copies of the Sunday State Tribune. The front page headline read, "Revolutionary Secret Uncovered, Washington's Hidden Contingency Plan Discovered on Local Farm." "It's already generating national interest," Elaine reported. The Associated Press picked it up overnight. Historical societies across the country are calling for comments. At precisely 9 a.m., when the bank's representatives were scheduled, To arrive to initiate foreclosure proceedings, a remarkable scene unfolded at Evergreen Farm. The bank's lawyers pulled in, accompanied by Harold Cunningham, only to find federal officials documenting the property and media representatives capturing every moment. Harold's face darkened as he recognized the federal insignia on the vehicles. "What is this?" he demanded, approaching Thomas with barely controlled fury. "Federal historical designation," Thomas replied calmly, handing him a copy of the protection order. "As of 4 a.m., Evergreen Farm is under the direct protection of the National Archives and Department of the Interior as a site of exceptional Revolutionary-era historical significance." The bank's lead attorney reviewed the document with growing concern. "This appears to prevent any property transfer pending federal historical assessment." "It absolutely does," confirmed the federal legal advisor, stepping forward. "Any attempt to proceed with foreclosure would constitute interference with a federal historical preservation directive, a serious offense with significant penalties." Harold Cunningham's composure finally cracked. "This is outrageous. A transparent attempt to prevent legitimate financial proceedings based on questionable historical claims. Claims authenticated by multiple independent experts," Rebecca countered, "and now formally recognized by the National Archives. The soil analysis your father tried to use to create doubt has already been refuted by our team's comprehensive documentation of the excavation process." As Harold continued protesting, a final vehicle arrived. Walter Cunningham, moving carefully with his walking stick as he approached the confrontation. Unlike his son's obvious anger, the elder Cunningham's expression revealed a more complex emotion, resignation tinged with something that might have been respect. "Federal intervention," he noted, studying the officials and their vehicles. "You've elevated this beyond our reach. Well played, Mr. Hargrove." "It wasn't a game," Thomas replied simply. "It was about historical truth." Walter nodded slowly. "A century and a half of carefully constructed narrative, undone by an ancient well running dry. Perhaps there's a poetry in that my literary-minded grandfather might have appreciated." He turned to his son. "Harold, instruct our attorneys to withdraw any pending challenges. This battlefield is lost." "Father, we can still—" "No," Walter interrupted firmly. "Some fights cannot be won, and wisdom lies in recognizing when to redirect our energies. The Cunningham family has always survived by adapting to changing circumstances." As the bank representatives reluctantly confirmed they would suspend all foreclosure proceedings pending federal determination, and Harold stalked back to his vehicle in barely suppressed fury, Walter lingered a moment longer. "What happens now?" he asked Thomas, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than challenge. "The truth comes out," Thomas replied simply. "Captain Winter's mission, Washington's contingency planning, your great-grandfather's suppression of the original land grants, all of it becomes part of the historical record. And Evergreen Farm becomes what it was always meant to be, a living connection to our nation's founding principles. The federal designation includes funding for preservation and educational programs. We're going to tell the whole story, Mr. Cunningham, not just the parts that benefit certain families." The old man nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "History is rarely kind to those who attempt to control it. A lesson my family perhaps should have learned generations ago." As Walter Cunningham departed, Thomas found himself standing between Rebecca and Samuel, watching as federal officials began the formal documentation process that would protect Evergreen Farm for generations to come. "Your great-grandfather would be proud," Samuel said quietly. "Elijah stood his ground against the Cunninghams when it would have been easier to sell. You've done the same, but accomplished something more. You've restored the historical truth. He never fully uncovered. We all did, Thomas corrected, his hand finding Rebecca's. The connection between them had deepened through their shared purpose, growing into something neither had anticipated when she'd first arrived to examine his discovery. Rebecca smiled, understanding the unspoken sentiment. Some discoveries lead to unexpected paths. As they watched the federal team work, Thomas reflected on the remarkable journey that had begun with drought and desperation. The ancient well had indeed run dry, forcing him to dig deeper, not just into the physical earth, but into history itself. What he'd found wasn't just water or treasure, but something far more valuable. Truth that had been buried for generations, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The farm would survive now, protected as a national historical site. The drought would eventually end, the fields would grow green again. But the most significant transformation wasn't in the land itself, but in what it represented. Not just a family legacy, but a direct connection to the nation's founding principles, preserved despite powerful efforts to bury it beneath layers of convenient falsehood. Thomas gazed across the fields his family had tended for generations, seeing them now through the lens of their true historical significance. Land chosen by Washington's own envoy as worthy of preserving the young nation's most essential principles. The ancient well had failed him in one sense, but in a deeper way, it had revealed something far more precious than water, a buried truth that would now flow freely for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.